Okay, good afternoon, everybody. I'd like to call to order the Atlantic Menhaden Management Board. By way of introduction, my name is Connor McManus. I'm the Vice Chair of the Menhaden Management Board. Mel Bell was unable to join us today in person, so I'll be serving in his capacity today as Chair. The first item we have on our agenda is approval of the agenda. Is there any interest in or questions or modifications to the agenda before us? Seeing no hands, I'll take that as approval by consent. And that brings us to our next item on the agenda for approval of proceedings from May 2023 meeting from the Menhaden Management Board. Are there any amendments or questions or revisions proposed regarding those proceedings? All right, seeing no hands, we will take that as approval by consent. And with that, that moves us on to public comment. So we'll be looking to take public comment up to 3 minutes per individual. I'll look first in the room if there's anybody who would like to make public comment.
Thank you, Mr. Vice Chair and members of the Commission. My name is Sean Guillen, and I'm here representing Omega Protein and Ocean Harvesters. Over the course of the past year or so, a lot of the opponents of the Atlantic Menhaden reduction fishery have taken up a lot of space in the the written comments and time at the mic, and we've kind of sat back. But there are a lot of people, new people on the Commission that haven't been involved in deeply involved in the Menhaden management process or seeing the fisheries that's evolved over the years. So we thought it would make sense just to take a moment just to sort of present a little background and some context for the comments. I think one of the things that's important to understand that this fishery used to be comprised of over 150 vessels, up to 20 operating reduction plants from Florida to Maine since the early 1950s. Today, it's one plant, 9 boats, 3 of which are just carry vessels. In terms of the health of the fishery, it's been above its ecological reference point abundance level since 1991. It hasn't been subject to overfishing according to the current definition of overfishing since 1986. And keep in mind that we've only been the management process prior to that time had much less conservative management targets. So the fishery's been very healthy for a long time. It's reached among its highest biomass estimate, second highest biomass estimate in 2021. In terms of the Chesapeake Bay, current harvest levels are about a third of what were prevailing in the mid-1980s, about half of from the levels from the early 2000s, both in part to management action, a cap on reduction of fishery in the bay since 2006, and efforts by Omega and Ocean Harvesters to minimize user conflicts and reduce their footprint. One of the things that's occupied a lot of my time is a new study about osprey in Mobjack Bay, and I've asked James to forward something, which I really apologize. I just did like half an hour before this meeting. So if he hasn't emailed it out, you'll see a document that specifically addresses that and has some of the background materials. But and I know that Rob Latour is here, and he can certainly speak to it better than a lawyer can. The scientific merit, but essentially they fed osprey menhaden and then determined that the reduction fishery, and somehow not the bait fishery in the Chesapeake Bay, was causing nest failures. One of the things that'll be in that document is Dr. Brian Watts, one of the authors on this study, was at the Ecological Reference Point meeting, and it indicated that most of the mortalities, the nest failures that occurred in May.
Sean, just wanted to acknowledge the timer for 3 minutes being up, so if you could.
Okay, let me just wrap that up, because most of that's in there. So I just wanted to point out that Menhaden entered the bay, but no fishing, all fishing occurred north of the bay. So if they entered the bay, it was not the fishery that was keeping them from, Osprey script. But do take a look. The fishery's been well managed by this board, and you should congratulate yourself on an excellent job managing the stock. Thank you.
Thank you, Sean, for your comments. Are there any other public comments in the room on items not related to agenda items? Okay, seeing none in the audience, I'll look to those online. We will go to you, James Fletcher. Feel free to unmute yourself.
My concern is that we're not talking about the microplastics or the man-made chemicals that are affecting Menhaden. And if we find out that there are microplastics, man-made chemicals affecting the Menhaden, should we not be trying to come up with a way to enhance the management by spawning the eggs and releasing them in the grow out areas? In other words, right now, we've not looked anywhere into the future. So my question for this board is, shouldn't you direct staff to look at the possibility of just spawning the Menhaden and then releasing the eggs by the billions with a B? We're reactive management, and the rest of the world is proactive management. And my question back to the board, should you not direct staff to look at microplastics accumulating on the gills of these fish, and then the possibility of enhancing the stock through just spawning the eggs, getting them fertilized, and then releasing them? We need to look a different way. Thank you, James Fletcher, United National Fishermen's Association.
Thank you, James, for your public comments. Is there anybody else online that would like to make comment on materials not currently on the agenda? Okay, feel free, Tom Lilly, to unmute your microphone. And again, just for folks interested, 3 minutes. Thank you.
Yeah, I have a couple questions for the board. As the board realizes, the collapse of the striped bass spawning stock has just been recorded for this year, which makes 5 straight years of the failure of our striped bass spawning stock in Chesapeake Bay. So I have some questions real quick here. Does the board agree that the striped bass spawning stock is the Commission's flagship species and the most important species for food, charter, and anglers, not only in Chesapeake Bay, but otherwise? And I presume you agree with that. Does the board agree that the ERP science says that striped bass are the most sensitive species to the Menhaden harvest? I agree. I believe you probably agree with that because that's what all of your science says. Do you also agree by sensitive, in the ERP science, you mean that it is the species most harmed by an improper Menhaden harvest? Do you agree with that? Do you agree that the most harmful effect a species can have is reproductive failure? I think you agree with those 4 things. Okay, since you likely agree that striped bass are having a terrible problem in the bay, and you agree the problem is caused by the level of the Menhaden harvest, and I think you agree the harvest is too great. I think you agree to all those things, don't you? Do you agree to all those things or not? Okay, so the last and most important question is that affects about all of Chesapeake Bay and the Atlantic coast wildlife and all the people. The question is this: will this Menhaden board right now make this an agenda item to be discussed and the solutions recommended? In other words, will you make an agenda item right now of the relation between the Menhaden harvest and the terrible failure of the striped bass spawning stock, which your ERP science are connected? Your ERP science establishes the causal connection of these two things. The question is, please make this an agenda item to be discussed right now at this board meeting. Will you do that? I'm waiting for an answer.
Thank you, Phil, for your public comment. The public comment period is a time for comments, not dialogue. So we appreciate your comments, and the board has heard them, and we'll consider them moving forward. And we have reviewed the agenda already and have approved that for today. So thank you for your comments. And with that, I'll move on to Phil Zalasek.
Mr. Chairman, over 60% of the coastal stock of striped bass begin to spawn in the Chesapeake Bay and its tributaries. The mortality rate of striped bass is directly tied to the mortality rate of Atlantic menhaden. The higher the mortality rate of Atlantic menhaden, the higher the mortality rate of striped bass will be. The Atlantic menhaden reduction fishery allocation in Virginia is currently 67% of the total allowable catch for the entire Atlantic coast. That's over 158,000 metric tons, or 3/4 of a billion fish being removed from Virginia waters this year. Intense reduction fishing is occurring during the same time when there is little migration of Atlantic menhaden in Virginia waters. That's called localized depletion. Currently, the reduction fishery has had great difficulty finding menhaden in the Chesapeake Bay and its entrance. The latest NOAA data indicates that the recreational harvest of striped bass in Maryland waters has declined 72% since 2016, and the Maryland Chesapeake Bay Juvenile Index for striped bass is at an all-time low. The decline of striped bass in the Chesapeake Bay is due to the lack of menhaden in the Chesapeake Bay. It is not due to overharvesting by recreational fishermen. Further, in 2016, the Maryland GDP associated with striped bass industry was over $800 million. That is no longer true after a 72% decline in recreational harvest. In 2020, this board reaffirmed its commitment to manage the fishery in a way that accounts for the species' role as forage fish. This board has failed in that commitment. I attended the Ecological Reference Point Working Group meetings 2 weeks ago and heard no discussion of striped bass mortality rate as it relates to Atlantic menhaden. In the interest of conservation and sound fishery management, it's time to federal waters. This will bring an end to Governor Youngkin's Canada First fishing policy to the benefit of American taxpayers who fish. It's also time to call Governor Youngkin's office at 804-786-2211 and raise holy hell. I thank you for your time.
Thank you, Phil, for your comments. Is there anybody else online with comments not related to agenda items? All right, seeing none, that will bring us to our next agenda item, which is a progress update on ecological reference point benchmark assessment. And with that, I will pass it to Dr. Katie Drew.
Great, thank you, Mr. Chair. So next slide. Basically, I'm just going to provide an overview of where we are in terms of our timeline and then some of the issues that we discussed at our recent data and methods workshop. So as you all know, this assessment is scheduled for completion in 2025. We had our method scoping webinar earlier this year in May. We had a deadline for new data submissions by September 1st. So that was for data sort of outside of our usual TC and state federal partnerships for external data submission. And then we had our data and methods workshop a couple weeks ago to start discussing some of the high priority issues for this assessment. Going forward, we anticipate that the 2023 data will be submitted sort of in waves from February to August of next year. So starting with some of our fishery independent data for menhaden, all the way through the multi-species assessments for some of our key ERP species, which should be completed over the summer. then followed up by a couple more methods and assessment workshops, so that we can ideally have a TC call to kind of approve the reports on our end in mid-July, to go to a peer review through the CDAR process in August, and have the assessments presented to the board in at annual meeting of October or November next year. So next slide. So at the data and methods workshop, we reviewed new data sources for Menhaden and their predators. We identified new predators to explore adding to the intermediate complexity model. So if you recall that previously our key ERP species were Menhaden, with an alternative prey of Atlantic herring in the models, and the key predators were striped bass, bluefish, spiny dogfish, and weakfish. So we have identified new potential predators to consider adding based on existing data, and if we can gather enough information to support including them in these intermediate complexity models. They are, of course, included in the full NWACS EWE model. But that includes nearshore piscivorous birds like osprey, bluefin tuna, smooth dogfish, or elasmobranchs as a group. We did consider blue catfish, but decided not to pursue it based on the limited spatial overlap with Menhaden. So right now, blue catfish are only concentrated in the Chesapeake Bay and are really only in the more freshwater areas. The diet studies indicate Menhaden do not make up a large proportion of their diet. So we do recommend, as we get more spatially explicit in future benchmark assessments, and as the blue catfish population continues to spread and expand, that be reconsidered. But for now, we will not be including it in this benchmark. Next slide. So we discussed high priority updates to our ecosystem models. We will be going forward with the NWACS mice and NWACS full models again, as well as the Vader multi-species statistical catch at age model. Those were all peer reviewed during the last benchmark assessment. And of course, we use the NWACS mice model as to set reference points. We are adding an ecosystem harvest control rule simulation model in order to provide some context to these models and explore alternative harvest control rules in an ecosystem context. The highest priority is increasing the spatial and seasonal detail in the models, but we will likely not produce a fully spatial reference point or management advice with this benchmark assessment. Next slide. We did discuss ongoing ecosystem indicator work in the Chesapeake Bay, including some work from Maryland and from VIMS, including some of which will be discussed in the next presentation. The ERP work group recommending allowing these projects to sort of come to completion on their own timeline rather than trying to duplicate effort with what they are doing. If you recall, we did discuss back in 2021, one spatial option for management is to use our current coast-wide models with some kind of spatial indicator approach, but the board was kind of cool on that idea and was not interested in pursuing it. So the ERP work group recommends allowing these projects to continue on their own, and then if the board wants to revisit this indicator approach linked to management areas for the Bay or for other areas, that you can task the work group with working on that after the benchmark, after this other work has been completed, and dedicating more time after that. So that about sums it up for the main topics of discussion at our data and methods workshop, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Katie. Are there any questions from the board? Yes, Jeff Kalin.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Dr. Drew. So I listened in on that too. A couple of gentlemen talked about the ERP model outcomes or reference points. And isn't it true that those reference points leave enough menhaden in the water to fully rebuild striped bass by 2029? Is that the reference point that was the outcome from that model?
So the current reference points are based on the coast-wide stock of both menhaden and striped bass, and the reference points are designed to leave enough menhaden in the water to support striped bass when they're fully rebuilt to their target. It's not specifically tied to that 2029 deadline, but in the long-term equilibrium, yes.
Okay, so it's not. Excuse me. Can I continue? Yeah, so it's not tied to 2029. I guess I misunderstood that. So it's just generally the fact.
So, right,
Okay.
in the long term, basically,
Okay.
as at equilibrium.
Thank you. Yeah.
Are there any other questions for Katie? Yes, Lynn Bailey.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. If I may, I have a comment and a question. And I'll start with the comment. I just wanted to provide some clarity for the board about the indicators that we've been working on in Maryland. So we have a broad array of data that we've collected for many, many years on both striped bass, things like striped bass body condition, being one in particular. So the piece that we're working on is really right now going to be geared as a communications tool. It's not geared to be a management tool, but it's really a synthesis of all of the data that we have. We spend a lot of time trolling through the information that we collect, and I think it's going to be a really nice way to inform stakeholders of how we're monitoring the situation around Menhaden and striped bass and the ecosystem in general in the Bay. So we're hoping to be rolling that out in the not too distant future. So that's one. I want to make it really clear that that's a communications tool right now, not a management tool. It would be really nice if in the years to come we could take it to the next level, but it's not there yet. So that's my comment. And my question is for Dr. Drew, and then maybe I know Dr. Latour, you're going to follow on, but you know, we have had our 5th consecutive year of low striped bass recruitment in Chesapeake Bay. We just heard from a couple of our constituents. There is concern in the Bay about this, any potential relationship between Menhaden abundance in the Bay and striped bass reproduction. So a linkage between Menhaden abundance and the recruitment of young striped bass. So I wanted to sort of toss that out to the scientists and just, I don't know if you can provide an answer now, but it would be, I'd kind of like to hear your thoughts on that, given the concerns that we're hearing from our stakeholders. Thank you.
So sure, I would say, I think I don't want to say there's no relationship, obviously, that Menhaden are an important food source for striped bass, and our coast-wide ERP model does show that striped bass are sensitive to the amount of Menhaden that are available for them. And so if your Menhaden levels are too low, your SSB levels will be too low for striped bass, and that can contribute to low recruitment. But striped bass recruitment is, of course, driven by a lot of factors. So obviously, the abundance of the spawning stock is part of that, but we also know environmental conditions like temperature, like water flow, like the availability of the plankton prey for those newly born striped bass, all are significant contributors to the overall success of that year class. And so Menhaden abundance is part of that equation, but it's not the only component, and it may not even be the most important component. I will say our ERP model on the coast-wide level, that is what that tracks. That is looking at that relationship of how much Menhaden do we need to make sure that the striped bass can survive and produce recruitment. And that is all tied together. That stock recruit relationship for striped bass is in that model, and the effects of Menhaden on striped bass survival is all in that model. And so at the coast-wide level, these reference points are intended to leave enough Menhaden in the water so that striped bass can maintain their target biomass and maintain that spawning stock biomass. Obviously, I think maybe a bigger question that we still need more work on is that relationship the same at different spatial scales? So what is happening in Chesapeake Bay versus what's happening at the coast-wide level versus what's happening in the Gulf of Maine? Those dynamics we don't have a good handle on. We're hoping to get a better handle on it through this next benchmark assessment, but that's definitely something we need more work on.
Great, thank you, Lynn. And we have Allison Colden online with a question. So Allison, feel free to unmute when you're ready.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chair. Thank you for the presentation, Katie. I also had the opportunity to attend the ERP work group meeting and observe some of these conversations, and just hope that I have absorbed some of that genius out of this group by osmosis. a lot of really exciting conversations going on, particularly around spatial models in a future benchmark assessment. But I wanted to just sort of ask a quick question and comment on a couple of things as well. Katie, maybe in particularly to the blue catfish issue to start, it's obviously a huge concern for us in the Chesapeake Bay, and we're seeing its influence grow both in the scope of where they're being found and the species that we believe that they're impacting. I believe that I saw in the ERP work group maybe some conflicting data where one data source was showing that blue catfish were consuming a large quantity of menhaden, or at least menhaden were making up a relatively significant quantity of their diet composition. But then other comments about the lack of overlap, spatial overlap between blue catfish and menhaden because of the difference in the salinity tolerances. So could you just briefly comment on kind of the thought process for the group and not continuing to pursue blue catfish as an ecosystem component?
Sure. So I think some of the initial work on blue catfish did have menhaden making up a bigger percentage of their diet than you would be comfortable with. But as part of that literature review, we looked at some other studies and more recent, much more comprehensive studies with thousands of blue catfish stomachs from multiple different areas and multiple different times of years and multiple different size classes showed that the actual percentage of menhaden in their diet was relatively low, especially compared to some of the other predators that are already in our model. So I think this is because blue catfish are omnivores, incredibly unspecialized. You need a really large sample size in order to be able to get a good handle on their diet. Otherwise, you're just going to be getting, it's too influenced by small sample size, which is probably why you saw in some of the initial studies, if the timing was right, you saw a lot of menhaden. But this larger, more comprehensive study said that the proportion of menhaden in their diet was much lower. So I think number one, so the work group had some more comfort as, they're not specializing in menhaden perhaps the way that we had concerns about. And then of course their range right now is predominantly in the more freshwater areas, and again limited only to the Chesapeake Bay as opposed to our full coastwide model. And so kind of the overlap of blue catfish versus the rest of the model, we felt that was a relatively minor component of the total mortality. And to be clear, these models, even the intermediate complexity models, have space for additional mortality that's not explained by our explicit predators. So it's not like a source of mortality is necessarily being missed, it's just being lumped into other predators. And so given the limited spatial overlap and the fact that the fact that they're really only in Chesapeake Bay at the moment, and the fact that they're predominantly in the more freshwater areas of Chesapeake Bay, the work group felt that this was not as useful of a predator to focus on, and that we should instead focus on kind of our other key species where we expect a stronger relationship, not just between predator abundance and menhaden abundance, but also between menhaden abundance and predator abundance. So that's why we recommended not going forward with it at this benchmark, but we definitely do want to keep an eye on that so that for the next benchmark, once we have a fully spatial model and can get down to the more nitty-gritty of modeling the bay more distinct, as well as potentially seeing increases in blue catfish out beyond that freshwater range or into the Delaware Bay or other areas on the coast, we think it's definitely worthwhile keeping an eye on for the future. So I hope that helps.
Yes, it did. Thank you so much, Katie. Although I think I read an article maybe even this week about catfish being found in Delaware River, Delaware Bay. So hopefully it will continue to stay a relatively confined problem. And one quick comment to wrap up here. I just wanted to reiterate something that Lynn mentioned earlier about the options and the efforts that we have going on in the Chesapeake Bay. I just want to extend some thanks to the folks in Maryland for spending a lot of time doing a deep dive on the striped bass and menhaden indicators. But I think Lynn made it clear that it was not intended to be a management tool. And I know we're about to hear a presentation from Virginia on some work that was discussed there, but I think that the board will see that it's a pretty extensive body of work that, if it were to be completed, would be a huge undertaking, especially just if it's being taken on by one state. So some of the other things I noticed in the ERP work group were that at least the spatial models that I saw discussed were not going to be able to resolve the Chesapeake Bay or maybe even some of the other estuaries along the coast. So I don't want to lose sight of the issues that we all know are lingering in the Chesapeake Bay and questions lingering about the Chesapeake Bay. So Katie, I don't know if the tasking about indicators is the right path forward, but I just wanted to flag that I don't necessarily know that what the efforts that Maryland and Virginia are undertaking now are going to result in, direct management applications, and would like the technical committee and the ERP work group to continue to keep Chesapeake Bay kind of on their minds and in the forefront as to how we can continue to resolve these questions and get the data that we need moving forward to resolve these issues. So just wanted to say that. Thank you.
Thank you, Allison. Are there any other comments or questions from the board? All right, seeing none, we'll move on to our next agenda item, which is a presentation that reviews the Virginia Chesapeake Bay Menhaden Study Design report, which will be presented by Dr. Rob Latour, joining us today. So with that, take it away, Rob.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you to Bob for the invitation to come back. It was nice to see some familiar faces last night and meet some new faces. It's been a while since I've been in the hot seat, as you say. Not sure I really want to come back that often, but I'm happy to be here. The title here indicates Menhaden Research Planning, and by no means am I trying to suggest that all the research for Menhaden is happening here at VIMS. It's certainly in coordination with the TC and the ERP work groups. It's a broad, inclusive effort, although it was stimulated this year by some legislation, which I'll review briefly. Next slide, please. By way of background, fall of 22 brought a great deal of activity, you could say, from stakeholders, specifically directed at the governor's office, and that carried forward into the 2023 Virginia legislative session with the General Assembly. There's lots of discussion, lots of concern, lots of perspectives raised, such that Senator Linwood Lewis initiated the introduction of a bill, Senate Bill 1388, that occurred on January 11th. And it said, VIMS shall do everything. We will solve all the problems. We will study everything, ranging from economics to ecology to fishery impacts to you name it, movements, everything. So in conversations with Senator Lewis and his staff, we sort of try to manage expectations and bring it down to a little more level of realism. So some substitute language was modified and introduced, and amendments were introduced, such that in the end, what passed through the General Assembly was a bill that directed VIMS to engage stakeholders for a planning effort. What do we need to know? What are the most crucial things that we should study, and outline them for consideration moving forward? Next slide, please. For anyone curious, this is the exact language of the bill. I don't expect you to read everything, other than the highlighted portion here basically breaks the bill into three sections: study the ecology, the fishery impacts, and the economics or economic importance of Menhaden in the waters of the Commonwealth. So what follows is a summary of our activities relating around those three themes: ecology, fishery impacts, and economics. Next slide. The way in which we approach this, the bill did not give direct procedural guidance per se. I suppose we could have done it at our desk and come up with some really cool research activities and some ideas, but rather than doing that, we elected to hold a stakeholder workshop. So we invited representatives from all the various sectors, trying to achieve broad representation from the commercial, the recreational, the NGOs, the academics, the federal agencies, the management community, And we held the workshop for a day and a half at William & Mary on August 8th and 9th. We engaged a professional facilitator to manage the meeting, and she did a fabulous job from the Institute of Engagement and Negotiation at UVA. Just by way of transparency, all the recommendations that you'll see from us were based on consensus. There was voting, but it wasn't really voting in a strict sense. It was more consensus based. And in my opinion, and some of you were here, some of you online were there, it was collegial and it was productive. So what follows now in the next few slides are just a summary of the 3 themes. And what I'm providing, next slide, what I'm providing are the top 3 consensus items in each of those themes. You can imagine that during the brainstorming sessions, we had lots of ideas, including the kitchen sink brought forward, but whittling those down over time, over the course of the workshop, led to these 3 areas for ecology, and that is, number 1 ranked was estimate the seasonal abundance of Atlantic menhaden in the bay, so breaking out abundance estimation, which routinely happens with the coastwide assessment and also with some of the ERP work. But on the coastwide scale, try to break that down into a Chesapeake Bay versus coast level of estimation. This would be akin to the spatial modeling activities that Katie referred to and that are perhaps on the horizon. By way of methods, this was analyzing commercial catch and effort data and also enacting new survey methods, since the commercial catch and effort data do not cover the entire bay. That is, those data are restricted to Virginia. So some of these new survey methods, ASMFC invested in the design of a survey for using aerial methods with the University of Maryland, making use of that survey design for aerial survey, as well as VIMS has capability now of a multi-beam Simrad EK80 hydroacoustic package on their research vessel, the RV Virginia. Making use of that has shown promise in other fisheries and other countries as a way of estimating abundance for pelagic schooling fishes. Second was evaluate movement rates. This is mainly focused on the exchange between the bay and the coast. You might think of this as adding to the body of knowledge as to whether a depletion is happening at a scale that's measurable or not. So how fast do fish move into the bay, out of the bay? How frequently does that happen over seasons, over time? Reproducing the 1960s tagging data, tagging study would be virtually impossible. So we have to resort to some sort of a hydroacoustic or some sort of other technology to do this. The hydroacoustic tagging technology, the tags are getting smaller and smaller. There is hope that this could be utilized for Atlantic menhaden, who would be sensitive to capture and sensitive to processing. And the third was assessing impacts of predator demand and consumption of Atlantic menhaden. There are extant data that could be used, but some of the seasons, some of the spaces where the predator-prey dynamics unfold are not well sampled and not well covered. So it would be a combination of data analyses, new methodologies, as well as new field work. On the fishery impact side, number 1 ranked concept was to analyze the patterns in the commercial fishing effort and catch data for Chesapeake Bay. The idea being that the fisheries know where the fish are, so they're going where the fish are. Maybe we can glean some insight as to possible changes in movement, possible changes in distribution, shifts in abundance, and this sort of thing through analyses of those data, acknowledging that those are not necessarily statistically designed catch and effort data. So we'd have to bear in mind the associated human element of those data. Number 2, assess the possibility of localized depletion. We heard a public comment regarding localized depletion. It's a very difficult concept to address. Certain criteria need to be met, and we don't know if those criteria are even being met to assess localized depletion. We thought that synthesizing the ecology topics 1 through 3 would be necessary in order to really address this issue in a serious manner, although certainly it's consistently discussed. And third, kind of surprising to me, was to quantify changes in the recreational fisheries in the bay. Not a lot of effort has been put forth to understand the demographic changes, the availability, the number of licenses, the age structure of the fishery, types of species that are being targeted, and how those shifted over time. Again, this might provide some insight into availability of menhaden and associated dependencies. Lastly, or thirdly, I should say, economic importance. I'm being true to the ranking system here, but to be honest with you, number 2 has to happen before number 1. But this is the way it fell out of the group. But basically conduct a contemporary assessment of the socioeconomic importance of Atlantic Menhaden to the Bay. Certainly there are some historic studies to draw on, one by Jim Kirkley at BIMS, one funded by ASMFC more recently. But updating those, it's a different fishery, it's a different management regime, it's a different economic climate. So updating that was of top priority. And given that tool, perhaps we could then assess the economic impacts of management decisions. So this is sort of getting at the concept of a management strategy evaluation with an economic component. So decisions that you make as a board, what are the trade-offs? What are the implications of those decisions? We learned a lot about how industry's product ripples through the entire Commonwealth, beyond the Commonwealth, all along the Eastern Seaboard, even internationally. And honestly, you know, in most of the fisheries management, biological sustainability is the #1 priority, but there is some importance to understanding how your management decisions ripple through the economics of fisheries and those industries that depend on that. So evaluating that was certainly of an importance. And third here was, I'm using the word bioeconomic. It wasn't articulated in such a way at the workshop, but there's lots of discussion about moving fishery removals out of Chesapeake Bay to the coast, restricting the harvest by the reduction fleet to the coast. It's not as simple as it seems. There's lots of trade-offs there, irrespective of the impacts it would have on the reduction industry. Moving all the harvest to the coast means you're harvesting bigger, older animals. These are more fecund, as opposed to those that are typically in the bay. So you would actually be having a larger impact on the spawning stock and the spawning production of animals than if you keep things as currently status quo. So bioeconomic meaning trade-offs economically as well as biological impacts to the stock about where the landings are coming from over time and space. That pretty much summarizes here. I've got just a list of contributors and want to thank everybody for being involved. In case you're curious about who attended the workshop, these are the participants. Like I said, we try to be broadly inclusive for all sectors and all stakeholders. And lastly, before I take any questions, I just want to give some acknowledgements, particularly to Shannon Madsen, Commissioner Green, for allowing Shannon to dedicate some time to this project. I know it was outside the scope of her duties, but she was integral in providing a lot of support and a lot of guidance. Christina was our UVA facilitator who did a fabulous job. Mark Lukenbach, Cecilia Lewis, and the VIMS administration for funding the workshop out of our own pocket. This was my idea to have it happen, and VIMS was on board with it, so I appreciate that. And Jim and Caroline, who are my students and staff, for participating in the meeting and being great note takers. So if there are any questions, I'll be happy to take them. Thank you.
Thank you, Rob, for your presentation. Are there any questions or comments from the board? Yes, Dennis Abbott.
Thank you, Mr. Latour. What are the plans for achieving results? When will we see something coming out of all these good ideas?
Really good question. And I can't give you an answer because we haven't been instructed or provided resources to conduct the work. This was a planning exercise. Initial feedback from the General Assembly and from the governor's office has been positive, at least with respect to the content of the report. Whether it gains traction with the governor's budget, which will be released in December, and or the General Assembly session in 2024 remains to be seen. But I think we try to do our best in providing a roadmap and a plan with some cost estimates, with some guidance as to who might be most poised to do the work, to give some instruction and some guidance to the administration. But where it goes from here is out of my control. Sure.
Thank you. Good answer. However, is there any thoughts of looking for money in other directions from NOAA or any other sources, Omega Protein, anyone else that's got deep pockets? And how much money are you talking about to do at this point, what you plan or would like to do?
The report structure outlined those 9 items in a stepwise fashion, and there were cost estimates associated with each. As you can imagine, those that involve novel field work are more expensive than those that involve desk work. The sum total for all of them was under 3 million, spread over 3 to 5 years. We haven't pursued funding opportunities outside of the state because really this was initiated by the General Assembly. It's not an unreasonable thing to do. I suppose with some more thinking and some more time, we could come up with ideas and pursue avenues outside of the legislature. But for right now, that's where we are.
Thank you, Dennis. Next up, I have Roy Miller.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Dr. Latour, I was wondering who will do the prioritization of all of this work that you outline, all of which looks like important work, but will the General Assembly be doing the prioritization? Will Virginia Marine Resources Commission, will VIMS, or some combination thereof?
Thank you for the question. It's a good one. Initial indications are that VIMS and VMRC, again, if Commissioner Green is willing to participate, would be involved in shaping any budget amendments that would go through. And so therefore we would be able to prioritize things in such a way that order of operations matters. Some of these studies depend on other things being done, so we could set that pathway clear from the get-go. What we don't know is what the appetite is to fund any of this. So, upon learning that, then we could move into the motion of actually drafting, preliminary language for any kind of amendment that would go forward. So it would be a combination of VIMS, VMRC, other constituents as well. By no means are we trying to make this a closed process.
Thank you, Roy. Are there any other questions or comments from the board? Yes, Lynn Fagley.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. Just real quick, I just want to thank Dr. Latour and the entire team listed on the screen. I was at that workshop. It was excellent. It was just a great reminder that it's often very helpful to walk into a room and sit down and have very frank and open conversations with a broad cross-section of people involved in a fishery. I know I went in with my back up a little bit and came out having learned a lot and feeling it was a great effort, and it's appreciated.
Thank you, Lynn. Are there any other questions or comments from the board? Looking around the room, not seeing any hands. Are there any online? With that, we are a bit at. All right, so there's no more questions or comments from the board. We are a bit ahead of schedule, so if there are folks from the public who have comments for some of the scientific presentations we've heard, we'll be able to take those comments if you so choose to present them. I'll start first with those in the room. If we have anyone with a comment, explicitly comments, no questions. Okay, seeing no one in the room, I'll go to those online. Bill DeSteff, feel free to unmute and when you're ready.
All right, apologize. I'm trying to figure out this platform still. This is Senator Bill DeSteff representing Virginia Beach in the east, coming up the Eastern Shore in Norfolk. On Menhaden, I listened to the comments. I had heard when I believe his name was Sean was speaking, he said that all fishing for Menhaden occurred north of the Chesapeake Bay. I see actually the boats out there with the nets, surrounding the nets and fishing, not just within the Chesapeake Bay, but on the other side, on the western side of the Chesapeake Bay Bridge Tunnel. There's always been a lot of conflict between the sport fishermen and those out of Reedville with Omega-3 and others, and we're hoping from the legislature that we can get a better handle on what's going on. We've had multiple agreements at multiple times, gentlemen's agreements of, hey, there won't be fishing within 3 miles of the beach. It'll be outside of 3 miles outside of the Chesapeake Bay Bridge Tunnel. So there's been multiple conversations and multiple agreements that never seem to hold much water and get violated frequently. So I've truly just gotten put on this commission. I'm looking forward to it and learning and seeing what I'm missing. I know a few of the folks that are here and have been briefing. Here listening, but I'm having a hard time with understanding, that everything is all good and well. And then I don't know if this is the platform for it or if I should write in and ask to VMRC or VIMS, how many violations did Omega receive this year over the last 3 years? I'm trying to get a lot smarter on this because what I'm hearing today is a little different than what I actually see, not just in my neighborhood, but when I cross the Chesapeake Bay Bridge Tunnel. And thank you.
Thank you for your comment. I'm going to pass it to Bob Beal really quick for a response.
Great, thank you. Yeah, not a direct response to Senator DeSteff's comments, but I just want to let everyone know Senator DeSteff is the new legislative commissioner from Virginia. He was appointed replacing Monty Mason in the last week or so. So the previous commenter was one of the new commissioners for ASMFC, and I assume will be participating in future meetings. So I just wanted to welcome him and let the board know that that's where the comment came from. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
And thank you for your comments. I'm going to look to staff to see if we can, whether the time to provide responses to those specific comments is now or subsequent to the meeting, given the scope of the comments. Yeah, staff will follow up with you if that works for you. So I appreciate your comment and your time. Is there anybody else online? Brian Collins, feel free to unmute when you're ready.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, thank you.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, I've been listening in. I had, I guess you could call them comments, questions that I would share. I've been studying this issue as a layperson, and it's a little baffling to me that the Chesapeake Bay is not considered a separate ecosystem. Earlier we heard there's estimates that 60 to 90% of all Atlantic coast striped bass occupy, or they go in the nursery of the bay. It looks like we might be starving them, and we see indicators that striped bass populations are stressed. Most of the time what you see is people blaming sport fishermen, no mention of industrial harvest. I don't think it makes sense to take the Atlantic coast stock and assume that it's okay to fish, take 51 metric tons, 100 million pounds of fish, Menhaden bait fish out of the bay. And that's separate from the idea that the definition of the bay boundary is right at the Chesapeake Bay Bridge Tunnel. So just outside the bay, the industrial fishing can use that additional limit to capture all the fish that are funneling into the bay and out of the bay. So it's probably way more than 100 million pounds. And, with this idea that we're doing a Virginia assessment, it doesn't make sense to me that Virginia in a bay that's about, I forget, I think Maryland has the biggest portion of the bay. How can it not be a multi-state effort? And how does ASMFC feel about it? Why isn't ASMFC taking the lead on this? And I heard a gentleman earlier saying, why not NOAA? Why isn't the federal government stepping in? Virginia can only do a compromise survey in Virginia waters. And I'm wondering right now, I've asked this question before of ASMFC and waiting for a response is, do we know if there's any schools of Menhaden in the bay right now? I don't think anybody knows. We could be starving. I went to a osprey nesting meeting. The osprey nesting performance for 2023 fell off like a rock. And we may not have the time that have been kicked around to actually save the bay. I mean, I think we're actually at a point where we might really want to consider seriously a moratorium until we can figure out what's going on. And I appreciate the opportunity to comment. Thank you.
Thank you, Brian. Are there any other comments specific to the presentations from Katie and Rob? Yes, James. Please feel free to unmute when you are ready. James Fletcher, have you been unmuted or have you unmuted? We are not hearing you, so I might suggest as an alternative to reach out to staff or Rob, if you have additional questions you'd like to, or comments regarding their work that you'd like to discuss. All right, seeing no more comments on the presentations we received, I'd like to move to our next agenda item on considering fishery management plan review for state compliance regarding the 2022 fishing year. And with that, I will pass it to James.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Good afternoon, everyone. I will just jump right in and start. You can just go to the next slide now. Thank you. How's that? Better? There we go. Okay. All right, so here's a quick overview of the presentation. I'll start with a pretty brief reminder of the statuses of the FMP and the fishery before providing the 2022 landings and monitoring information and ending with the PRT recommendations. So in 2022, the fishery operated under Amendment 3, which was approved in 2017 and implemented in 2018. The total allowable catch, or TAC, for the 2021 and 2022 fishing seasons was set at 194,400 metric tons, based on the board-approved ecological reference points. Also based on those ERPs, which were adopted in 2020, and the 2022 single species stock assessment update, fishing mortality is below both the ERP target and threshold, and fecundity is above both the ERP target and threshold. Therefore, the stock is neither overfished nor experiencing overfishing. So moving on to 2022 landings, total commercial Atlantic Menhaden landings in 2022, including directed incidental catch and episodic event set-aside landings, are estimated at 195,387 metric tons, or about 430.8 million pounds, which is an approximate 0.15% increase relative to 2021 and is 0.51% over the TAC. If you remove the incidental catch and small-scale fishery landings, so that leaves you with just directed landings and the EESA landings, the total for 2022 is estimated at 187,231 metric tons, or about 413 million pounds, which is a 1% decrease from 2021 and represents approximately 98.6% of coastwide, around 8,156 metric tons or 18 million pounds, but they did not count towards the coastwide TAC. The 2022 reduction harvest is estimated at 134,477 metric tons or 296 million pounds, which is a 2% decrease from 2021 and 1.5% below the previous 5-year average, which was about 301 million pounds. Of that, within the Chesapeake Bay, about 50,000 metric tons were taken, which is under the Chesapeake Bay cap by about 1,000 metric tons. So this figure shows landings from the reduction in bait sectors through time. So you have the reduction landings on the left-hand axis and bait hand landings on the right, and I'll make a note to please notice the different scales of those axes. So reduction landings are generally about an order of magnitude larger than bait landings. Generally, the trend shows a decline in reduction landings over time. Relative to last year, bait landings had a slight uptick and reduction landings had a slight drop, but the overall trend remains fairly consistent. As mentioned, incidental catch and small-scale fishery landings are estimated at 8,156 metric tons or 18 million pounds, which is a 46% increase relative to 2021. Incidental catch trips also increased to the highest level since 2015. Maine, Massachusetts, and Virginia's non-purse seine bait fisheries specifically reported incidental catch landings, about 82% of which were from purse seines, 10% from gillnets, and Maine accounted for approximately 87% of incidental fishery landings in 2022. Maine and Massachusetts were the only participating states in the episodic event set-aside program. Their combined landings were 1,992 metric tons or 4.4 million pounds, which was a 10% decrease from 2021, but is over the total set aside by 104,723 pounds. To alleviate this, Massachusetts transferred 64,000 pounds to the ESA in January of 2023, and the remainder was deducted from the 2023 set aside. Quota transfers remained high. There were 24 state-to-state transfers, some involving several states in 2022, which was an increase from 16 in 2021. Although the PRT noted in the document that one of the purposes of the commercial allocation changes in Addendum 1 to Amendment 3 was to reduce the need for quota transfers, and the PRT will monitor the change in quota transfers after implementation in 2023. Non-de minimis states are required to conduct biological monitoring based on their bait landings as well as their geographic region. So from Maine to Delaware, 1 10-fish sample is required per 300 metric tons, And from Maryland to North Carolina, 1 10-fish sample is required per 200 metric tons. In 2022, Maine fell just short of the required samples, collecting 35 of 39 required samples. For de minimis, Pennsylvania, South Carolina, Georgia, and Florida all requested continued de minimis status and qualify based on their commercial landings. As far as PRT recommendations, the PRT continued to discuss whether a sufficient number of biological samples are being collected from different gear types and regions, and whether substituting samples from fishery independent sources is appropriate for meeting the requirement. Having said that, in discussions with science staff, it will be a topic that is considered in the single species assessment update, which is scheduled to be presented to the board in 2025. And with that, the action for the board today to consider are to approve the 2022 FMP review, state compliance reports, and de minimis requests. And with that, I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you for your presentation, James. Questions for James? Yes, Megan Ware.
Thank you. I just wanted to provide some context for our biological sampling to bring us back to last year. End of August, Maine closed its small-scale fishery due to the volume of landings we were seeing, so that prohibited us from being able to collect additional samples. We're at 55 samples this year, so we should be well and above what we need for our landings so far.
Thank you, Megan. Any other questions from the board in person or online? Yes, Emerson Hasbrook.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Seems like there's no more questions. So if you're ready, I'll make a motion to accept the review.
Thank you, Emerson. Staff have been kind enough to prepare a motion. If you're willing to read that in for the record.
Move to approve the fishery management plan review, state compliance reports, and de minimis request for Pennsylvania, South Carolina, Georgia, and Florida for Atlantic Menhaden for the 2022 fishing year.
Thank you, Emerson. Do I have a second? Seconded by Roy Miller. I may ask to see if there's any opposition to the motion. All right, seeing none, I would consider this approved by consent. So thank you for getting us through that pretty quickly. And with that, now we're on to other business. Is there any other business from the board? Excellent. I guess I would just like to say this would have been Mel Bell's last meeting as chairing the Menhaden Management Board. So I just wanted to say thank you to him for his leadership after the last couple of years. And now you have yours truly for the next 2 years. So thank you for bearing with me. And yeah, thank you again, Mel, for your service on the board as chair. And with that, I will look to see if we have a motion to adjourn. I see many hands. So thank you, and we can consider the meeting adjourned.